Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism lunchtime seminar. I'm David Feldman, the director of BISA, and it's a huge pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Jan Rybak, and a special pleasure because Jan, since October 2021, has been an early career research fellow at the Institute. He's the author of Everyday Zionism in East Central Europe, Nation Building in War and Revolution, 1914 to 1920, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2021. And his current research project, which underpins his presentation today. His current research project analyzes Jewish armed self-organization and self-defense from the partition of Poland in the late 18th century to the violence that followed the end of the First World War. And you'll immediately see the connection between that and the title of his paper today, which is Europe's Battalions, Jewish Self-Defense and the Making of Europe's Long 19th Century. Jan, over to you.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, for the invitation to speak. I will be sharing my screen. I hope that works. Will it work before? No. One second. Here you go. Can you see that? Can somebody give me a thumbs up or so? Perfect. Thank you very much. So I've been asked to do two things today. So first, I'll be speaking about the larger project on Jewish self-armament and self-defense through Europe's long 19th century. And I'm trying to show what kind of questions I'm engaging with what kind of topics I'm discussing, the questions that I have. And then I want to give a concrete example of how this works in practice, how this forms of Jewish organization, of armed organization, works in one specific case study that's towards the end of my chronology. I'd like to say that I'm at a rather early stage in this project, so much of these things are work in progress, and I will be particularly grateful to hear from everybody on their thoughts and their feedback and their comments and so on. So let me start. It was a Polish newspaper claimed the first independent Jewish army formed since the dispersion of the Jews that was created during the Polish uprising of 1794 by Berik Joselewicz and Josef Aronowicz. Not dissimilarly, a Hungarian politician claimed at a commemorative event in 1998 that the Jewish company in the Hungarian National Guard of Pest, founded 150 years earlier in 1848, was the first of its kind since the Bar Kokhba uprising. And back during the 1905 revolution, some of the Jewish fighters and revolutionaries in the shtetls and Jewish neighborhoods of Poland and Ukraine wrote about the site with amazement. For the first time ever, it seemed, Jews appeared armed and organized, confronting their enemy. Now, none of these cases were the first of their kind since the Jewish dispersion, since the Bar Kokhba uprising. We may look back to the Jewish fighters and resistors during the Khmelnytsky pogroms in the 17th century, or even further back, but I have to admit this is somewhat outside of my chronological comfort zone. The claim, however, of all these moments in which Jews armed themselves and fought in their own independent units, being the first, being extraordinary, something hitherto unseen, I believe, points to more specific understanding of Jewish diasporic history. Jews taking up arms appeared extraordinary, contrary to what was to be expected. It contradicts the ideas of Jewish passivity and victimization. And yes, these were indeed extraordinary moments and extraordinary people. But if we take a broader view, I would argue that what they did actually points to a specific pattern, that they fit a specific pattern, which we see repeatedly throughout Europe's long 19th century. Now, since the second partition of Poland, when the aforementioned Berg-Joselewicz raised the Jewish regiment to fight alongside the Polish insurrectionists, Jews regularly formed independent armed units in the course of the violent transformations of Eastern and Central Europe. They appeared most commonly in the context of social upheaval, revolutions, and the disintegration of state authority. So in 1830-31, Joselewicz's son, actually, Josef Berkowitz, was involved in raising a Jewish city guard in Warsaw, which participated in the defense of the city during the Polish November uprising. During the revolutions of 1848-49, we see the aforementioned Jewish company in Pest and several separate units of the National Guard being established in Moravia, as well as in Lviv and in Krakow. During the 1881-82 southern storms, the pogroms in the Russian Empire, some Jews resorted to armed self-protection, and following a call by the Viennese government in 1898, Jews in Galicia formed citizens' guards to support the army in the suppression of a wave of plunder and violence. In the years of revolution and anti-Jewish violence in the Tsarist Empire, in the years 1903 to 1907, especially in 1905, in Ukraine and in Poland, Jews joined numerous Selbstschutz, self-defense armed units to protect their neighborhoods and their shtetls against pogroms. While at the same time, they were often understanding themselves as being part of a wider revolutionary movement. With the collapse of Europe's multinational empires after the First World War, Jewish militias fought in Lithuania and especially in Ukraine, where they numbered many thousands and effectively controlled large areas and defended it against an unprecedented wave of pogroms and terminatory, actually, violence directed against them. While socialist Zionists formed the independent Jewish battalion in the Soviet Red Army, and Jews in Galicia formed militias and citizens' guards to protect and defend themselves and fight for their place in the new Polish order. And for several months, two of Vienna's predominantly Jewish districts were effectively controlled and patrolled by a Jewish volunteer guard. So it is a long history of Jewish struggle and armed organization. And I obviously don't have time to present all these cases here. I speak about one of them a bit later, but these and several other cases are the stories that I'm looking at. And while all of them were, of course, unique, they point to a pattern of behavior, a path of action and agency of Jews throughout the violent transformation of Central and Eastern Europe in the long 19th century. Historians have paid considerable attention to the role that Jews' conscription to states' armies have played in the process of modernization and emancipation from the late 18th century. The argument going that from shared sacrifice for a common cause, equal rights could be derived. And at the same time, authorities, especially imperial authorities of Austria and Russia, authorities believed that military service would reform or better the Jews and make them worthy, strong inverted commas, of the rights bestowed onto the Christian citizenry. But how do these independent units fit in here in this story of emancipation through armed action? I would make the case that this recurring phenomenon of independent Jewish armed organization, the self-perceived fighting in decided Jewish form, constitutes another trajectory in the process of emancipation, self-emancipation indeed, through the long 19th century. Any rights or emancipation that would come from this sacrifice would not be granted by benevolent authorities, but claimed by oneself. While at the same time, any supposed transformation or supposed betterment of the Jews would come from themselves. And analyzing this pattern, I believe, not only allows for a deeper understanding of Jewish strategies and experiences in periods of warfare and violent transition, but in turn also allows for a new perspective on these transformations themselves by centering at the interaction, interdependence between the Jewish minority and wider society. Now, when the Jewish volunteers in Warsaw rallied around Berg-Joselewicz, and 35 years later around his son to defend Warsaw against the onslaught of the Russian Imperial Army. When Tanczisz Michali, a non-Jewish revolutionary actually, formed the Jewish company to make a distinctly Jewish contribution to the defense of Pest, Budapest during the Hungarian uprising against the Habsburgs, or when Jews joined the Berberochow battalion, the Jewish battalion in the Red Army, to defend Minsk in 1920 against the Polish invasion. They were fighting and dying not only for a Jewish cause. They were fighting for a wider, or in their understanding, also part of a wider war. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, the people involved here could have enlisted in the general insurrectionist or states armies, but they didn't. They wanted to fight in these wars in their own units, in their own forms, and often with Yiddish as the language of command. Sometimes the independent role was forced upon them. In some cases, National Guards would not accept Jews into their ranks, making them create their own units. And especially obviously in the case of pogroms, when violence was directed against the Jewish community as such, Jews' decisions to band together and to fight in their own units, often with little or no non-Jewish support, was often the only choice available. But there was always a wider element involved, a struggle for the sake of society at large and for the Jews' place in it. To put it in another way, when these people found themselves in a situation when the state and the society around them was transformed by violence, if one wanted to be part of this transformation, the only option was to engage in violence oneself. And if Jews wanted to be part of this transformation as Jews, they would have to participate in these revolutions and in these defenses and so on as Jews. Or this was the thinking of the people who organized these groups. Obviously, these moments of armed organization and defense were crucial in the development of Jewish communities throughout the region, and crucial in the biographies of those who participated in these struggles. However, this is more in the biggest possible commas than a Jewish story. It is, I believe, a story about the making and remaking of European states and societies. And I believe that when we alter our perspective and read these processes from the perspective of a marginalized but armed minority, we can think about some of these questions involved here anew. Many of these moments of Jewish self-armament came in situations when the state was weak, in the process of collapse, or was about to be fundamentally remade through a revolution. Hence, the way in which people acted, aimed to assert themselves, and wielded authority speaks to the imagination of both the state and the organization of society. And this is crucial for both the forms and the functions of this organization. So for example, ethno-nationalist exclusionary violence directed against Jews and other minorities was often the harbinger of the ethno-nationalist state that would be born through this violence. Think about Poland after the First World War. At the same time, many of the armed organizations, Jewish or otherwise, often assumed or enforced many different functions traditionally reserved for the state, such as maintaining public order, providing food, running jails, and even dispensing justice. So if one of the constitutive elements of a modern state is its monopoly on violence, as Max Weber and many others have argued, centering on the armed organization and the use of force by marginalized minority should lead us to rethink this process, I believe. The project, therefore, what I try to do is aim to think anew not only about the Jews' place in the process of European state formation, but the state and the use of violence itself should, I would argue, be understood much more as in a dialectical process, highlighting the interdependence between authority, civilians, the state, and the subaltern. Now, a lot of theory, a lot of thinking about big questions, and I want to now provide something like a local case study to show how this works in practice. So I'd like to zoom in into one specific moment towards the end of my chronology. And this is the formation of Jewish militias and citizens guards in Galicia, former Habsburg Crown land, and especially in Krakow, around the end of the First World War, and the state building projects and the large-scale anti-Jewish violence that followed it. Here is a pre-World War I map of Galicia, and here you have you can see Krakow in the west of the former Crown land. Now, the collapse of the Habsburg state and the establishment of the Second Polish Republic as its successor in Galicia is commonly seen through the dual overlapping frames of state building and anti-Jewish violence. What I aim to do here is to look at what this meant in practice and to introduce the Jewish militias here as a factor into the discussion that should make our picture more complex and I think more interesting. Now, the pogroms that swept through the region after the collapse of the Habsburg state and with the outbreak of the Polish-Ukrainian War over its succession are relatively well studied. Most infamously, obviously, the pogrom in Lviv, Lemberg, of 21st November 1918, which cost the lives of at least 72 Jews, probably more, with hundreds injured and lots of property destroyed and plundered. This has been studied quite extensively, given that it shaped or overshadowed so much Polish-Jewish relations in the interwar period and arguably beyond. And it is from this context of the pogroms that we also know about some of those militias, and most famously about the Jewish militia in Lviv of November 1918. But similar organizations were set up throughout the region, and preliminary research suggests that some forms of Jewish self-defense, so militias or guards, were established in around 25 towns and neighborhoods throughout the former Crown land. So what happened? And to find out, I went to the Polish archives last May and looked at the extensive collections of police and gendarmerie records that are held there. Because I had known about the existence of these Jewish militias from other sources and from the scholarly literature, and was convinced that, well, if there are a lot of people running around with guns, then the police, which usually recorded everything quite meticulously, would certainly take note of that. And to my exceeding frustration, there was nothing. There was nothing in Tarnów, there was nothing in Oświęcim, there was nothing in Chrzanów, in Bochnia, in Mielec. There was one disappointment after another. Interestingly, however, not only were there no entries on the Jewish militias, or hardly any, but looking at the police records from late October and in November 1918, there were virtually no notes at all. So most members of the police and the gendarmerie appear to have just stopped showing up to work exactly at the time when it became interesting for me. And who could have blamed them? Because the state of the Habsburgs, to which they had sworn allegiance, had ceased to exist. But wasn't there already another one? Wasn't there already a Polish state? And after all, a temporary Polish government for Galicia, the Liquidation Commission, existed in Krakow since the 1st of November, and the Second Polish Republic was proclaimed in Warsaw 10 days later. Wasn't also the new state, or any state, reliant on having a force to police its citizenry? Was this the first ever state without a coercive force at its disposal? And nobody has ever yet noticed so far. And the answer is the one that historians always give. It's complicated. So as locals realized that the Austrian state was losing its grip on the situation, they turned their pent-up anger against its last remaining representatives, the local gendarmes and policemen, who had harassed them for years. They had confiscated the food, they had arrested the menfolk for desertion, for avoiding conscription. So local stormed police and gendarmerie posts, took their arms and established improvised militias. Sometimes the policemen were also beaten up. They now, from small villages to larger towns and to cities, these people now usurped state power locally and from below. So the force of coercion existed, but it existed bottom up and locally. How these guards were set up, what their agendas were, and how they related to the various communities in the town depended on local conditions. Zygmunt Lasocki, who was the head of administration of this of the Liquidation Commission, the temporary Polish government, wrote that these guards, quote, were related to the population of these towns and neighborhoods by kinship and special interests, and that they were, quote, untrained and failed completely, proving their unsuitability in providing security, end quote. But however untrained and unsuitable and unwilling to keep proper records, they were now the ones with guns, they were the ones in charge. And the Jewish militias were part of this story. They don't appear as a reaction, they are appearing in tandem. In some places, such as in Chrzanów, West Galicia, Jews were at least initially integrated into the local guard. Elsewhere, such as in Oświęcim, Jews were established their own independent units that protected the community from marauders, from plunderers, and eventually from pogromists. And the creation of these military units was possible not least due to the abundance of both men with military experience and of weapons in the region. An estimated 300,000 Jews had served in the Austro-Hungarian army during the war. Many of them came from Galicia. And now with the Habsburg army broken on the battlefield, they made their way home, often carrying the rifles with them. Additionally, the massive arsenals, usually located in or around major cities and on railway junctions, often lay abandoned, and without the government able to take charge of them, they were taken over by locals. Jakob Billig, a veteran of the Habsburg army and one of the first commanders of the Krakow Jewish Guard, wrote in his diary that acquiring weapons, quote, is actually the easiest. A question of money and nothing else. It is possible to get small arms of any kind for bread and cigarettes, and in the large arms depots, you can obtain cheap machine guns and even field guns. So just as everyone else, the Jews of Krakow armed themselves and formed their own military units in the Jewish quarter of Kazimierz in late October and early November. You can see here on the map of central Krakow, Kazimierz is to the east by the river. This was done with the explicit self-armament was done with the explicit approval of the Polish Liquidation Commission, which even requisitioned a local school for its accommodation and seemed to have even supplied weapons. At least that's what some of the sources say. It's also quite probable that they just signed off and officially permitted the self-arming and the requisitioning that was already ongoing by the militia itself. Because what else could they do? Because nonetheless, there was clearly some cooperation. A joint leaflet signed by the Jewish Military Committee, the Command of the Guard, the Jewish National Council, and the Polish Liquidation Commission, which was published on the 8th of November 1918, called on all Jewish soldiers, quote, to whom the well-being of Jewry is dear, to enlist and to protect their city and their community. But would they come? Would the Jews of Krakow take up arms yet again after years of warfare? Jakob Billig noted his concerns about recruitment. Quote, I believe that on the first day, only the young people would show up, probably hundreds. After that, we will surely have to come back and inform and publish and persuade. But on my way from my house to the synagogue to my office, I could just barely walk through the alleys. There were crowds of people. Most of them are bearded and wear long black coats. God in heaven, are these my soldiers? Not the young ones, no, the older ones. It is the elders and the pious who are the first to be protected, and they come in large numbers and with such fervor. Around 1,000 volunteered initially. They patrolled the streets, they set up checkpoints at the entrance of the Jewish quarter and maintained order on the streets. While Krakow, not least due to the efforts of the militia, did not see the large-scale attacks and pogroms against Jews in the autumn of 1918 that we saw in many other places throughout Galicia. The situation in the surrounding West Galician towns grew increasingly dangerous for Jewish communities. And as a response to pleas for help from these communities, the Krakow Jewish militia in early and mid-November dispatched units to places like Brzesko and as far east as Mielec in an attempt to stop anti-Jewish violence there. We can already see that the relations with the Poles were much more complicated locally than merely outbursts of anti-Jewish violence. What the Polish state in the making did, or was forced to do here, was to essentially concede aspects of its core function to local communities, including the Jewish community. Maintaining order, protecting life and property, even beyond the boundaries of a local community, at times was a task assumed by people themselves. However, empowering the Jews, or any other community for that matter, never was the agenda of the Liquidation Commission. Theirs was a Polish national state-building project. They had made concessions to local communities when they had taken up arms and usurped state power, where little existed to begin with. They had recognized and permitted processes over which they had little control anyway, and so as soon as they could, they tried to get ahead of events and enforce or rather establish a state monopoly on violence. To do so, they aimed to integrate these rogue grassroots structures and thereby taming them, gaining control over them. In most towns and villages, the Liquidation Commission could decree that citizens had to surrender their weapons and that the militias ought to be merged with the remnants of the gendarmerie, making them subordinate to the command in Krakow. This process also entailed dramatic changes for the Krakow Jewish Guard. On the 13th of November, the government decreed that it would no longer be permitted to dispatch units to other towns for the protection of Jewish communities. Not that they had asked for permission in the first place, but still. 2 days later, the Jewish units were officially disbanded and ordered to surrender their arms to the Polish military posts. And this was followed by a series of raids in the Jewish quarter, where further weapons were confiscated, and the commanders of the initial guards, including Yakov Billig, were temporarily detained. Similar to other places in the region, however, the transitional Polish government did not aim to fully suppress the Jewish militia, but rather its autonomy as an independent actor. It wanted to integrate it into its state-building project. It therefore replaced, or rather substituted, the initial independent militia with a centralized citizens' guard, Straż Obywatelska. The one in Krakow was, at least nominally, subordinate to the magistrate and established in all quarters of the city from mid-November. And it was broadly organized by districts, with the Jewish neighborhoods of Kazimierz and the adjacent Stradom. I don't know if you see my cursor, but yeah, here's Kazimierz, here's Stradom, and with them being predominantly Jewish districts, kind of by default, this became a Jewish militia, officially answering to a central headquarters where you see the commanders here on the right. To highlight the degree of organization here and to emphasize the quasi-state role the Jewish Guard played, at this stage, they had moved from enlisting volunteers to universal conscription. All men, all Jewish men, that is, in the Jewish quarter, were called up, were examined, and if found suitable, enlisted in the Guard. A total of 3,497 men, that's about the size of full infantry regiment at the time, were enlisted. You see a list of recruits or members of the Guard on the left. On the right, you see an ID card of one of the militiamen. Obviously, these were way too many recruits. And even though weapons were quite freely available, it was impossible to fully equip them all. Also, having them in service all the time would have ruined the economy, obviously. So the purpose of this mass enlistment, this full-scale militarization, essentially, of the Jewish community of Krakow, I would argue was something else that went beyond security and defense. It was also to discipline and to integrate, and maybe even more. If as historians of European states, have rightly argued, universal conscription was a key element in the formation of modern citizens-based states. So then what we have here is its own unique form of essentially a form of state building. Not really territorial, obviously, because Kazimierz is quite small, but with many of the other elements that made a state, crucially with a local, at least, monopoly on violence and the inclusion, coercion, and disciplining of its own citizenry. And while keeping a core of about 250 professional soldiers, most of the other men became reservists, being called up about once every 10 days or so for patrol duty and exercise. Again, you can see that on the right here on this ID card. There below on the lower side, you can see when Meyer Kratzer was on duty. On a daily basis, the Guard ran the show in Kazimierz. They maintained law and order, they controlled the entrances to the neighborhood, and they were in control of food supply, controlled the market, and tried to suppress black marketeering. And these were crucial tasks at a time when, due to years of war, food supply had been shattered and hunger was widespread. A booklet in the Guard's files contains a list of people who were fined for various crimes and misdemeanors. The offenses themselves were not always recorded, but they appear to have mostly been related to property and merchants demanding, so theft, petty theft or something like that, and merchants demanding unreasonable prices on the market. For more serious transgressions, the Guard ran its own jail. Again, I think quite an impressive thing for a local militia like this. The greatest test, however, for the Jewish Guard came in the spring of 1919, in June 1919, when General Josef Haller and his troops came to the city from the bloody campaign in East Galicia on their way to Silesia. The Blue Army, as it was called, had not only defeated the West Ukrainian People's Republic, but its soldiers had gained notoriety for the violent anti-Semitism and the brutal pogroms against the Jewish populations in the war zone. From the train station, from throughout the city, news arrived that hundreds of Halle soldiers, joined by civilians, plundered Jewish shops and assaulted Jews on the streets, cut off sidewalks and beards and so on. None of the other city guards seemed to care. A Jewish guard did not intervene outside its district so as not to give pretext for a larger assault, but barricaded the neighborhood and mobilized its reserves. At night, several hundred soldiers assaulted the Jewish quarter, and while they managed to break through the defenses at several points, they were met with fire, they broke and ran. One of the defenders later remembered that the soldiers were shocked, Halle soldiers were shocked, and they fled because, quote, Jews dared to push them back, although surely the Lord did his part as well, end quote. Now, this was one of the very few cases in which Jewish militias successfully engaged in repelled attacks and prevented a pogrom in this period in Galicia. While the self-defense was at the heart of the militia's task, I would also argue that there are many more dimensions to it. It's a story about state building, essentially. It's about the emergence of the Polish state, that many of the key elements that constitute such a structure, crucially the power of coercion, the monopoly on violence, were also assumed by the Jewish Guard. Was this even a form of Jewish state building? Question mark. If we separate our understanding of the state from territoriality. Or was it national autonomy in the making? Crucially, I believe that the transformation of Galician society, the formation of the Polish state, and to different extents, this is true for many of the transformations of Eastern and Central European societies that I'm looking at, these stories can look a bit differently than what we're used to when we take this local perspective, when we take the perspective of a minority. And this is, especially when we center the analysis on the marginalized minorities, on the Jews. When a situation in which the society around them was transformed through violence, the only option to be part of his transformations was to take up arms oneself, to protect oneself, but crucially also to be part of the remaking of European states and societies. And with that, I'm closing, and thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Jan. That was really so interesting. Both the detailed research and the larger conceptual framework in which you placed your comments. If you have questions or comments that you'd like to raise or put to Jan, please raise your virtual hand. Before I pose my question, I'll just ask Atan Weska, who's working the video for us. Could you please unspotlight me and Jan so I can see all the people in the room, because that makes it easier, not just Jan, but to go back to a picture where everyone is seen, because that just makes it easier for me to see hands which are raised virtually. But while that happens, Jan, let me ask you one question. I mean, I have many questions, but I'll just ask you one which comes from the end of your talk and really asks you to project forward in time, because as we know, the Polish state was not the new Polish state, which you called an ethno-nationalist project. It was not friendly to the sorts of autonomy expressed by the Jewish militias. So was there a process? And if there was a process, when was this process? When the Jewish militias were actively disarmed? And was there resistance to that process?
Yeah, thank you. It's locally very different. So in many of the cases where the Jewish militias are confronted by pogromists, which usually happen when outside forces come in, like Allah's army, for example, the local commanders of the Jewish militias usually have to make a decision whether it's worth defending oneself whether this is feasible, militarily feasible or not. And if they, or at which point is it more dangerous to defend oneself and then thereby risking even greater wrath? At least that's the thinking at the time. So in many of the cases, they one by one lay down their weapons and are then, which is then still followed by pogroms. So this hope that if we surrender our weapons, we will be safe. This is one disappointment after the next. What is important is that many of these militias are not created necessarily to be able to militarily engage the Polish or the Ukrainian army. They're created to protect the community against marauders and plunderers and so on. That there are thousands, tens of thousands of deserted or then discharged soldiers who are starving and roaming the countryside. So, and to maintain public order and so on. So this is what they're set up, and they're not really set up to defend, to militarily engage a campaign, with some exceptions. They're also not successful. So locally, they are either disarmed in these moments when these larger armies come in, or in the case of Krakow, for example, they are then slowly disarmed over the summer of 1919, but together with all the other local militias that were set up by ethnic Poles, by various communities throughout the region, because the state or the Polish state starts to establish itself and really wants to get rid of these forms of local autonomy and local self-control and local self-armament. So it's a gradual process, and it's really very, very different from one locality to the next.
That's interesting, and it's not, and as you said, it's not only a process which is aimed at the Jewish militias, but although it's different in the case of the Jews, it's also part of a broader process. Brendan, you have your hand up.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Hi, Jan, I thought that was terrific. I've been looking forward to this paper for a long time, and obviously you did not disappoint. So really, thank you very much. And I think what you've given us here, this idea of Jewish militias as a form of state building, is really, to me at least anyway, original and innovative and exciting. I wanted to ask a question about something you said kind of in parenthesis, somewhere around the beginning of the talk, about the formation of Jewish militias being connected to the idea of, now you didn't use this term, but it was the term I had in my head, productivizing Jews or rendering them useful. I think you may have used the word useful. I can't remember. And I wanted to just ask you a little bit about that, because I think here is where potentially the politics of anti-Semitism comes in an interesting way. Now, obviously, as you've told us, the formation of the units and the militias are a direct response to anti-Semitism, the spectre of anti-Semitism, the threat or the actuality. So, okay, it's a response. But I wondered if we could, or if you could reflect a little bit upon the process of forming such militias and whether the decision to form or not form a militia was itself overdetermined by the idea of anti-Semitism and the politics of anti-Semitism. Maybe these are just deadly encounters where Jews get together and form militias and don't think twice, okay? But the reason I ask this is because in a different context, in the Russian Revolution, which is the one bit I know about, something about, the decision to form Jewish-only units was actually really thought through very, very carefully. And the Bolsheviks, for example, really agonized over this question. And it brings to mind Sartre's observation in his book on anti-Semitism, where he says, you know, what anti-Semitism does for the Jew is it makes a simple decision impossible, because you're always looking at yourself through the eyes of others. You know, how will the anti-Semite view me if I make this decision? And that's exactly the kind of dynamic that captured those Jews and non-Jews who were involved in discussions about Jewish-only units in the Russian Civil War. You know, would a Jewish-only unit undermine anti-Semitism by showing that Jews could fight and did fight and were willing to fight on the front and were physical and muscular and all the rest of it? Would that undermine one set of anti-Semitic stereotypes? Or would it perpetuate another set, which is that Jews stick together and don't join in wider, you know, formations such as, say, the Red Army in this case? I just wondered, in your archive, in your sources and in the stories that you're uncovering for us here, have you encountered this kind of dynamic where anti-Semitism intervenes no matter what, and whether the possibility, the always present possibility of anti-Semitism, not just the deadly anti-Semitism in the shape of pogromists, but the perception, whether that influenced the actions of Jews in these battalions, but also non-Jews who were passing judgment on the formation of these battalions and their usefulness or otherwise for combating anti-Semitism. I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very important point. I'll break it down into two things. The first is the idea of productivizing a usefulness and so on. I mean, this is a predominant thought in amongst the elites and the governments and the emperors in Central and Eastern Europe. Essentially, like, in order to give Jews whatever rights they could get, they would need to prove first that they are worthy of them. One way of proving to be worthy of them is to serve in the army. So, for example, in the Russian Empire, if one of the few exceptions to get a permission to live outside the Pale of Settlement was to having served in the army. So, this being the argument behind it, and and this is something that is like fundamentally rejected by these independent organizations. So saying, yeah, we're fighting, but we're not fighting on your terms, and we don't care what you think that Jews have to do in your anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic imagination. We are here on our own terms. We're doing that, and I think this is a very powerful impulse that really runs through it, even if some of the people are sometimes reluctant to discuss that in public. What in most of these cases are, and this is a fascinating thing, I think, that speaks to the second part that you're discussing, what they usually put to when they're discussing, especially in the public, what they put to the fore is to the forefront. What they emphasize is, we're doing this for the sake of society, and we're doing this for everybody. This is not a particular Jewish thing. We're doing this as Jews, but just to show how great Polish patriots or great Hungarian patriots or great whatever we Jews are. This is what we do, because this is the language where they believe this will be accepted by society. Usually, or sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. But this is the argument that they're trying to make. I think what some of them, and this is also, by the way, this is reflected in the publications and what they're writing about. So, for example, these Jewish militias in Galicia in 1918, one of them I've talked about, they are, at the time, they're not really advertised. They happen, and they're quite large in some cases, but especially on the international level, on some, like the Jewish activists don't emphasize that. So there's this heavily used booklet on the pogroms in Poland by Israel Cohen, who was sent there by the Zionist organization to report on that and then to present the case to the peace conference in Paris. And so he mentions these Jewish militias in like side notes and like in one sentence or so, but only in the context of it was dissolved and then there was a pogrom. But if you look at Cohen's archive, there are mountains of, well, mountains. There are many letters by people who were engaged in these militias or who saw the militias and so on, reporting about them, and he kind of ignores them. because in an international, to an international audience, this is his concern apparently, this would look really bad, like Jews taking up arms, Jews fighting and so on. This is really not the image that we want to show to the world. So it's always this maneuvering between what, as you said, like what do we think wider society expects from us, but in the end it's always or in most cases, like anti-Semites will be anti-Semites, no? They whatever the Jews do, they will not yeah, they will blame them for them. And this is in many cases, this only, like, people only realize that in hindsight, many years later. Is something that people are reflecting on in memoirs and so on in later discussions, and not very rarely actually in the moments themselves. Hope this answers it.
Thank you, Jan. We have a number of questions now. So I think if the questions are relatively brief and the answers are a little briefer, we'll get through all of them, starting with Mark Volovici.
Thank you. So thank you, Jan, for this really terrific talk. One question, I mean, while listening to your lecture, I was reminded of Stephen Zipperstein's work on the Kishinev pogrom, and especially on his chapter on the resistance, which is an interesting story of the memory of anti-Semitic violence, that, you know, it became such a shocking and in some ways a traumatic event. But interestingly and somewhat unintuitively, the Jewish resistance during the pogrom organized a sort of military response to the pogrom in Kishinev was kind of, you know, forgotten. Not only by those depicting the violence, but also by, you know, those participating in the events and afterwards. And it's a curiosity, and I'm wondering if, you know, how come the history that you're telling, or that you're now sort of revealing to us to some degree, why is hasn't it been sort of reclaimed or become sort of a mythical part of the history of you know, Jewish self-organization as nationalists, as patriots, or whatever? Why is it somehow omitted from, you know, both from general history of anti-Semitism and, more importantly, from Jewish political history of this period?
That's a fantastic question. So some of these cases have been studied quite extensively, especially in the interwar period. So especially the case of 1794 and 1830-31, they are really central in a Polish-Jewish narrative about Poles being Jews being Polish patriots and fighting for Polish independence. Like virtually every Polish town has a Berka Joselewica street named after Berek Joselewicz. And this is really an important factor there. They're not, but they're they're employed, or these stories also right now, by the way, the Jewish Historical Institute has an exhibition on that. So if anybody's in Warsaw, there's an exhibition on Jews fighting for Polish independence from 1794 to 1918, I think, or something. This, so highly recommended, by the way. So it is studied in a local context and in a national context, and with Jews being part of like an integrative element of these national stories. And then there are some cases that made it to prominence, like especially Jewish self-defense in 1905. And one of the reasons I believe it made it to prominence is because it is, and to a large extent rightly so, considered to be a precursor of Jewish armed self-organization in Palestine. So many of the fighters of the 1905 self-defense later made Aliyah and played an important role in the establishment of Jewish self-defense in Palestine. This is where it fits into a larger story. Other cases, such as Galicia 1918 and so on, they don't fit into and also Kishinev to an extent. Well, Kishinev generally, the resistance there doesn't fit into a large story, into a large argument that can be made about Jewish organization, Jewish defense, especially in cases where they were not successful and so on. So what's the case to be made there? And it's yeah, that is my take on it. We have in recent years there's a certain turn to, like in historiography, a turn to violence again. So there's this fantastic dissertation by Michael Kalman on the Jewish militias in Ukraine. There is several works on Jeff Weidlinger's book on again on Ukraine and so on. So there's a turn towards that, and I think that these yeah. Oh, and last sentence on that. There is obviously a strong case, especially in Israeli historiography, on these organizations being the precursors of the Haganah, which again they have, to an extent, they have a point, but I don't think that many of these cases, they don't fit into this into like these teleological narratives.
Thank you, Jan. Louise London, you have your hand up. And you're muted, Louise.
Okay, hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I know nothing about this, but I wanted to ask you, partly because I was struck by an early photo you showed, the Zeltschutz in, is it Dwingst or Drinkst in 1905, where I think I glimpsed several women dotted about, a couple at the front and maybe one in the middle or the back. And it prompts me to ask what, and this may vary very much, about what records there are of women playing a role in the organization, supplying, and possibly even arms bearing in these units. That's the question, really.
That's a fantastic question. So the best known cases of women in these organizations, and especially in self-defense, is during 1905, like the people in Dvinsk on this photograph. And this is a fantastic, there are a number of really, really good sources on that, especially autobiographies and memoirs, because this was such a break also with the marginalized position, not only of Jews in wider society, but also of women within Jewish society. And it was like a dual fight for emancipation for many of the, especially young women who were fighting there in 1905, often entailed a break with their families and so on. So it's a really important, fascinating element of that story. Of the cases of 1918, so the case study that I presented, there are explicitly no women in the Krakow Jewish militia. So there's a file on women in the wider Krakow militia, and there are none from the Jewish district. But I know of several women fighting in the successful defense, self-defense, in early November of the Jewish community of Oświęcim, for example. Just a few kilometers to the west, where I know that they were involved in first taking over the arms depot, and then also supplying fighters. And then there are some hints in the sources of to women also fighting. So this is not completely unheard of. It's still a rather very small minority in these cases, but it's an exceptionally important case, because I think because of this fight against two oppressions.
Thank you.
Really very interesting. Eliana Hatchisavas, you have a question, or your hand is up.
Yes, thanks, David. Jan, thank you so much. That was really interesting and quite far from my sort of research interest, but fascinating stuff. I think you've already actually answered this question, but I'm just going to pose it to you anyways. You might have some more takes on it, because you just mentioned the Haganah, and I was thinking about sort of the formation of the Jewish brigade. And obviously, after the Second World War, the Jewish Brigade then plays this really crucial role in sort of working covertly within Europe to help transport arms and refugees, which obviously all goes towards establishing the state of Israel. And I was wondering if these are obviously very different contexts and different histories, but if there is, or if there are interconnections, and if it is possible to kind of look at this through more of a wider global transnational sort of lens.
Thank you. So I'm kind of ending my chronology in 1921, because I think then after that the conditions changed quite fundamentally. Nonetheless, there are obviously trajectories towards the Jewish brigade in the Second World War, towards the Naphtali Botwin Company in the Spanish Civil War, so Jewish company in the Spanish Civil War, but also crucially to Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, and Jewish partisans and fighters in Eastern Europe. And some of these the questions that are raised earlier in earlier cases of defense are then raised again in the defense and the resistance of Jews against the Nazis. What I think is an important terms of the Jewish, this idea of in itself of having a Jewish brigade in the wider army. This is something that really becomes a major trope in the First World War. And I think in that sense, there is a strong connection. So this, as I've mentioned before, like the idea of universal conscription, like everybody being a key element in state building and in nation building, like everybody is equal, well, obviously not, but like with the argument of a state being like everybody's equal or in the same unit and so on, this binds us together, is an argument against separate units in a way. And the First World War really changes that. So there's the Jewish Legion most prominently, but there are Polish legions. I mean, there are 4 different Polish legions fighting on 4 different sides in the war. There are there's a Ukrainian legion in the Habsburg army, and so on and so on. And there's also so this idea of independent, also then Jewish units in as part of that really emerges there. And there are obviously stronger connections to later forms of organizations, such as the Jewish Brigade during the Second World War, but also obviously the Jewish battalions in the Red Army after that. So it's a new thinking that kind of starts earlier, but it becomes implemented for the first time in 1914, and then gets more and more important. And it's still like in many several armies, the idea of like special national units, so to say, kind of in many countries, not in all, but it's still an element that is considered today in how an army is organized.
Thank you, Jan. We're almost out of time, but I'm going to use the privilege of my position here to ask a second question, which is just because I think, although Jan drew out the really important implications of his current research for the ways in which we think about state formation and the ways in which Jewish history can contribute to our understanding of state formation, as well as to Jewish self-organization in the long 19th century. Listening to your paper, I wondered if there's another dimension to this research which we need to take into account, which is to say, there are many accounts of Jewish emancipation in the long 19th century, which treat it as a very, as a state-oriented process in which states give rights to Jews. But actually, listening to your account and thinking about other moments of emancipation, key moments of emancipation, from the Russian Revolution to the French Revolution through 1848, emancipation was actually a far less orderly process than the historiography sometimes presents it, and that Jewish emancipation and the crisis of the state in the long 19th century are really two processes which go hand in hand. It goes hand in hand very often with the breakdown of the monopoly of violence, and this is one of the really important things which your research brings to light.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Sorry, are you finished? Or yeah, this is really what I. So it's obviously it's a Jewish story in so many respects. In the what this meant for local communities and how this transformed local communities, how memory. It's about memory work. It could be I mean, this is probably not what this is not what I'm going to focus on, but it could in itself be a story about historiography, how these specific moments are remembered then by Jewish historians in the 1930s and in the post-World War II period, and so on, did in interpretations of that change and so on. So it's a multi-layered story. And one of them, and I think crucial one, is it's a story about how emancipation works locally, how especially also people experienced it and how they thought about it at the moment, because none of these things were obviously guaranteed. And I think one of the key things that I want to emphasize is when these people organize themselves and they fight for, I don't know, Polish freedom or Hungarian freedom or the democratization of that state, they do that with a specific idea of what would the place of the Jews be in this society in the future. And they expect, or they're in the process of taking emancipation for themselves. In a way, they are emancipated when they take up arms. And think that, or is an argument to be made that if a Jewish if hundreds in some cases of Jews stand there with arms and confronting an enemy, this is a form in itself of emancipation, taking being their arms in hand. And at the same time, it's also, I think, a tool to look at European state formation and European transformation. As we always do, we don't consider ourselves to be universal historians who look at everything. We look at specific cases and specific people, and they tell us a lot about a wider story. And I think looking at a marginalized minority and people in the marginalized minority that take up arms is a very interesting and very, I hope, productive tool to rethink this larger story about European, the making of Europe and European states and societies to a large extent.
Well, I think, Jan, over the last hour, you have demonstrated exactly that. It's been a hugely stimulating paper, and you've been extremely generous with your answers to the questions. So I just want to thank you very much and look forward to reading the results of this research, and in my case, have the privilege of speaking to you about it in the very near future. Thank you very much indeed. Before people go, I'll just say that our next lunchtime seminar will be on the 15th of March, when Nona Meyer from Sciences Po will be talking about anti-Semitism in France today. Thank you all very much for coming along, and I look forward to seeing many of you again on March the 15th. Thank you all. And thank you,
very
Jan.
much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.